pretending to be my father? Why did mom recognize his face before I even said his name? And why did David reach for my phone first?
Put the phone down, Sophia. My mother didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. In our house, quiet meant the decision had already been made, and I was just being given a chance to obey before David stepped in. But I kept the photo on the screen. The man who had messaged me said his name was Elias Mercer. He said he knew my birthday, my hospital, and the name my mother used before she married David. He didn't ask me to call him Dad. He only said, "Show her my face and watch what she protects first." So I did. Mom looked once. Her hand loosened. The phone slipped from her fingers and hit the kitchen tile hard enough to crack the silence. David reached for it before I could, and Mom, pale as paper, whispered, "Who told you to find him? Not why, not how, who?" Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. David held my phone like it was evidence, not mine. His thumb hovered over the screen, close enough to lock it, far enough to pretend he wasn't deciding what I was allowed to know. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Mom sat down slowly at the kitchen table, one hand pressed flat against the wood, the other at her throat. She looked smaller than she had a minute ago, but somehow the room still belonged to her. It always had. Even when she was afraid, I was the one expected to apologize for noticing. "He messaged me," I said. "Elias Mercer." David's eyes moved first, not to Mom, to the hallway. To the little cabinet where they kept passports, insurance papers, my birth certificate, and every document I had never been allowed to touch without someone standing over me. Mom saw him look. Then she looked at me. That was the first crack. For 19 years, my father had been a fixed sentence in our house. Aaron Blake left before I was born. Aaron Blake didn't want responsibility. Aaron Blake was the reason Mom worked double shifts. The reason David stepped up. The reason I was supposed to be grateful instead of curious. But the man in the photo didn't look like a ghost from a sad story. He looked like someone my mother had been waiting to fear. "What did he say to you?" Mom asked. "Enough." David placed my phone face down on the counter, gentle, careful. Like violence was only violence when it made noise. "Sophia," he said, using the voice he used when teachers called home, and he wanted them to believe he was reasonable. Men like that study vulnerable girls. They learn dates, names, old details, then they make you feel chosen. I almost believed him. Because that was the cruel part. My life had trained me to doubt myself before I doubted them. Then Mom whispered, "Did he mention the hospital?" David turned toward her so fast she stopped breathing. I hadn't said anything about a hospital. Neither had Elias, not in a way I understood. He had only typed one line before sending the photo, "Ask her why your file was sealed twice." I looked from my mother's pale face to David's hand covering my phone. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether Elias Mercer was lying. It was why my parents already knew which lie he had found. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared of Elias Mercer, though that would have been easier to explain. I didn't sleep because every warning my mother and David had ever given me suddenly had a second meaning. Like the house had been speaking a language I only understood after someone handed me the alphabet. By morning, my phone was back on the kitchen counter. Unlocked, wiped clean. David said he had done it for my safety. Mom said nothing. She stood by the sink in her robe, rinsing a mug that was already clean, while David explained that I was too young to understand how dangerous emotional predators could be. He did not yell. He did not threaten. That was never how control worked in our house. He just made the room smaller until my choices looked childish inside it. "You're 19, he said, sliding the phone toward me. "You think that makes you independent. It doesn't make you untouchable." Mom flinched at that word. Untouchable. I noticed it because I had started noticing everything. The way she wouldn't say Elias's name. The way David kept calling him that man. Like naming him gave him rights. The way my mother's fear wasn't shaped like jealousy or old heartbreak. It was shaped like recognition. "I want to know why he had my information," I said. David smiled without warmth. "Because people can find anything online now. Not my hospital," I said. "Not the name Mom used before she married you." The sink stopped running. For a second, the only sound was water ticking down the drain. Mom turned slowly. "What name?" And there it was again. Not denial. Measurement. She wasn't asking because she didn't know. She was asking to see how much I did. I remembered being 7 years old, sitting at this same table, while David filled out school forms in thick black ink. He had corrected my birth certificate twice, because he said the county office had made a mess of things. I remembered asking why my middle name was Claire when nobody in the family was named Claire, and Mom telling me it was just a name she liked. I remembered how fast the subject changed whenever I asked about Aaron Blake. Aaron Blake, the father with no pictures. Aaron Blake, the man whose face I had never seen. Aaron Blake, the name that had always felt less like a person and more like a locked drawer. Mom, I said carefully, was Aaron Blake real? Her hand tightened around the mug. David answered for her. That's enough. It was such a small sentence, but it landed with years behind it. Enough questions, enough memory, enough of me trying to separate truth from gratitude. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to correct him, to choose me over whatever silence had lived between them before I was old enough to name it. She didn't. Instead, she came closer, lowered herself into the chair across from me, and reached for my hand like she was the one being hurt. Sophia, she said, some truths don't give you freedom. They take away the life you already have. That should have sounded protective. It didn't, because people who are protecting you say what the danger is. People protecting themselves tell you not to look. Later that afternoon, when David left for work and Mom went upstairs, I checked the cloud backup on my laptop. David had wiped my phone, but he hadn't known Elias's message had synced before he touched it. The photo was still there. So was the line under it. Ask Marianne why your original file was sealed twice, not Mom. Marianne. And beneath that, one more message I had not seen before. Do not ask David in the same room. I read that message 3 times before I understood what scared me about it. Not that Elias knew David. That Elias knew I might make the mistake of trusting him. By dinner, David was back in his usual chair at the head of the table, cutting into his food with the same calm precision he used for contracts, bills, and conversations he had already decided how to win. Mom barely ate. She kept watching my face, searching for something, maybe guilt, maybe fear, maybe proof that I had done what they wanted and let the story close around me again. I kept my laptop upstairs, I kept my questions quiet. That was the first thing Elias had taught me without being in the room. Quiet people heard more. So David said, setting down his fork. Your mother and I talked. I looked at Mom. She stared at her plate. We're concerned, he continued, not angry. Concerned. That was always the word adults used when they wanted control to sound gentle. About what? I asked. About how quickly this man got into your head. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I had spent 19 years with other people living in my head rent-free, labeling every thought before I could finish having it. Too sensitive, too dramatic, too ungrateful, too obsessed with a father who supposedly never wanted me. Now one stranger had given me a name, a photo, and a question, and suddenly curiosity was a medical condition. Mom finally spoke. Did he contact you again? No. It was the first lie I had told her that felt less like betrayal and more like balance. David studied me too long. Give me your laptop. The fork in my hand went still. For what? For your safety. There it was again. Safety, a word stretched thin enough to cover anything. I looked at my mother. Are you okay with this? Her eyes filled too fast, but she didn't cry. I am trying to keep you alive inside a life you can survive. I didn't know what that meant. David did. His jaw tightened, just once, and Mom looked down like she had said too much. That small mistake changed the air. Because David was not acting like a stepfather, protecting his family from a dangerous man. He was acting like someone managing damage. Mom was not acting like a woman whose abandoned ex had returned. She was acting like a witness who had been told not to speak. I pushed back my chair. I'm not giving you my laptop. The room became very still. David didn't stand. He didn't have to. His silence did what his body didn't. You live in this house, he said. I'm home for break. You receive support from us. I receive control from you. Mom whispered my name like a warning. David's expression changed then, just slightly. Not anger. Disappointment, polished and ready to use. He took out his phone, scrolled once, and turned the screen toward me. It was an email draft. To my resident advisor. The subject line said, concern regarding Sophia Voss. My stomach tightened before I read the rest. He had written that I was being contacted by an older man online, that I had become defensive and secretive, that my mother feared I was being emotionally manipulated. Every sentence was clean, reasonable, almost loving. That made it worse. If you won't protect yourself, David said, we'll have to ask other people to help. Mom closed her eyes.
Maybe this wasn't protection turning into control. Maybe control has been wearing protection's face from the beginning.
She had known. Maybe she hadn't written it, but she had known. That night, the email went out. By morning, my RA texted asking if I was safe. My aunt called 5 times and left voicemails about how fathers who disappear do not suddenly return without wanting something. A cousin I barely knew sent me a message saying mom had already suffered enough, and I should stop punishing her. In 24 hours, David had taken the private fear in our kitchen and turned it into a public version where I looked unstable for questioning it. And the worst part was how well it worked. I began to hear myself through their voices. Maybe Elias had studied me. Maybe he knew exactly which details would make me doubt my mother. Maybe I was so desperate for a father that I would follow any man who spoke gently enough near the wound. Then, at 2:14 in the afternoon, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. No greeting, no explanation. Just a scanned newspaper clipping attached to a blank message. The headline was faded, but still readable. Local social worker suspended in adoption fraud investigation. Under it was a grainy photo of a younger woman leaving a courthouse with her coat collar pulled high, her face turned away from cameras. I knew that profile. I had watched it bend over birthday cakes, school forms, fever thermometers, and every locked door in our house. The woman in the clipping was my mother, and underneath her name was another one, David Voss, attorney for emergency custody petition. I stared at the clipping until the words stopped looking like words. Adoption fraud investigation. Suspended social worker, emergency custody petition. My mother had not been beside the story of my life. She had been inside the paperwork. For a few minutes, I did nothing. I sat on the edge of my dorm bed with my laptop open, the email glowing in the dim blue light, while the hallway outside carried normal sounds I could not enter anymore. Girls laughing near the vending machine, a door closings. Someone's music leaking through the wall. It felt impossible that the world had not paused with me. Then my phone buzzed. Mom, I let it ring. It stopped, then started again. This time, David's name appeared. I didn't answer him either. The third call came from Mom again, and something in me knew they weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because someone had told them I had received something, or because they had expected me to break by now and come home confused enough to be managed. I opened Elias's email and typed one sentence. Why did you send this to me? His reply came 8 minutes later. Because you were taught to confuse fear with proof. That sentence made me angry before it made sense. I wanted names, dates, a straight line from what I believed to what was real. Instead, Elias kept giving me pieces that forced me to pick up the shape myself, as if he knew that if he told me everything too quickly, I would hear my mother's voice in my head and reject it just to survive. Another message appeared. Meet me somewhere public. Bring no one. Tell no one. Library on Prescott Street tomorrow at noon. Cameras at every entrance. I almost closed the laptop. Then I saw the attachment below his message. A second image. Not a newspaper this time. A hospital bracelet. The photo was old, the color washed nearly yellow, but the black printed letters were clear enough to make my skin go cold. Infant female. Temp name, Claire, County Memorial Hospital. The birth date matched mine. Not close. Exact. I told myself it meant nothing. Claire was my middle name. Maybe Mom had seen the bracelet once. Maybe Elias had stolen documents. Maybe he had built all of this from scraps because people with enough patience could make lies look official. But then I remembered being 7, asking why none of my baby pictures showed me younger than 3 months. Mom had said the first camera broke. David had said I asked too many sad questions. The next morning, I went to the Prescott Street Library with my hood up and my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I chose a table near the information desk, under a security camera, because I needed every detail of that choice to be rational. If Elias was dangerous, I wanted witnesses. If my parents were lying, I wanted no room for them to say I had imagined this. He arrived exactly at noon. Older than the photo, but the same controlled face. Gray at his temples, dark coat, no flowers, no dramatic apology. No shaking hands like a man reunited with a daughter he had lost. That should have comforted me. It didn't, because I had come prepared to hate him as my father. He sat across from me and placed both hands flat on the table where I could see them. Sophia, he said quietly, I need you to listen before you decide what I am. What you are, I asked. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something there that was not affection, not exactly. Recognition, maybe. Responsibility worn down by time. I never told you I was your father. The library noise thinned around me. My mind rushed backward through every message, every word, every assumption I had made. Because the wound was already there, and someone had finally touched it. You said you knew my father, I said. I did. My throat tightened. Aaron Blake? Elias's face changed just enough to answer before he spoke. No. I felt the floor move under the chair, though nothing had shifted. He opened a folder and slid a photocopy toward me, not close enough to touch my hand. Just close enough that I had to choose whether to pull it nearer. It was a case summary from 19 years ago. Most of it was redacted, thick black bars swallowing names, addresses, and whole paragraphs. But the visible parts were enough to build a cage around the truth. A missing infant from County Memorial Hospital. A delayed transfer order. A social worker assigned to emergency placement. An attorney who filed a temporary custody petition that was later challenged and then sealed. Marianne Voss. David Voss. And one name that had never been spoken in my house. Daniel Bennett. I stared at it until the letters blurred. Who is Daniel Bennett? Elias did not soften his voice. Somehow, that made it kinder. He was your biological father. The sentence landed without drama. Maybe because drama needed room and my entire chest had gone still. I waited for grief, but what came first was insult. A strange, sharp insult that my own father's name had existed somewhere in the world while I had been handed a replacement story like a pacifier. Aaron Blake had been a ghost built to keep me obedient. Daniel Bennett had been real enough to erase. What happened to him? I asked. Elias looked down at the folder. That was the first time he seemed older than he was. He tried to reopen the custody case after he found inconsistencies in the hospital transfer records. He died before the hearing. How? Car accident. I laughed once, because the answer sounded too convenient, and I hated myself for thinking that before he did. Elias did not correct the silence. He only said, there was never enough evidence to prove it was anything else. I pushed the folder back like it had burned me. Why are you doing this now? Because one part of the seal expired. Because your DNA profile matched a Bennett family relative. Because your mother saw my face and reacted before she had time to perform. My mother. Not Marianne. Not the woman in the article. My mother. The word split me in half. I stood too quickly, and the chair legs scraped against the floor. A librarian looked over. Elias stayed seated. I can't do this, I said. I know. No, you don't. I know enough to know you'll want to ask her one question first. I hated that he was right. By the time I got home that evening, Mom and David were already in the living room. Not surprised. Waiting. Mom sat on the couch with a tissue folded neatly in her hand. David stood beside the fireplace, arms crossed, not angry yet, because anger would admit he had lost control of the first version. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Elias. Do not let David answer for her. I looked at my mother. Who is Daniel Bennett? The tissue crushed in her fist. David stepped forward. Mom whispered, please don't. But she wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to him. David stopped anyway, and that frightened me more than if he had shouted. Because for 1 second, my mother had control over the man who had controlled everything. Then David looked at me and said, very carefully, you don't know what your real father was worth. And that was when I understood this had never only been about who I was. It was about what I owned. For a moment, nobody moved. The sentence stayed in the living room like a fourth person. You don't know what your real father was worth. Not who he was. Not what he meant. What he was worth. Mom's face collapsed before David could take the words back. She looked at him like he had finally said aloud the part they had survived by never naming. I looked at her and asked, is that why you kept me? She made a sound so small it almost wasn't a word. No. David turned sharply. Marianne, but the name did something to me. Hearing him call her that, the same name Elias had used, the same name printed in the old article, made her feel less like my mother for one terrible second and more like a woman standing in the middle of evidence. I pulled the photocopy from my jacket and placed it on the coffee table. The case summary, the redacted lines, the visible names. Marianne Voss, David Voss, Daniel Bennett. Mom stared at the paper without touching it. David didn't look at it at all. That was how I knew he had seen it before. You met him, he said. It was not a question. I nodded. His mouth tightened, but his voice stayed smooth. Then you've already let a bitter old man turn you against the people who raised you. Raised me as what? I asked. Mom covered her mouth. David's eyes hardened. For the first time, his calm looked like effort. You were a baby, he said. You needed a home. Your mother gave you one. My mother? I asked, looking at Marianne. Her eyes filled, but she didn't reach for me this time. Maybe she knew touching me would not make the truth smaller. I loved you, she whispered. I believed that. That was what made it harder. Because love did not erase the locked cabinet, or the fake father, or the wiped phone, or the emails to my school, or 19 years of teaching me that my own questions were cruelty. You told me Aaron Blake left, I said. You let me hate a man who didn't exist. Mom shook her head. Aaron was real. David glanced at her. There it was again, a crack, another layer. He was real, she repeated, but weaker. He just wasn't your father. The room tilted in a quiet way. I understood then how their lie had survived so long. They had built it from pieces of truth. A real name. A real man. A real disappearance from someone's life. Just not mine. Daniel Bennett was my father, I said. Mom closed her eyes. That was the answer. David stepped forward, but I lifted my phone before he got close. The screen was recording. His expression changed so fast I almost missed the fear underneath the insult. You're recording us? Yes. My voice shook, but I didn't lower the phone. David looked at Mom, and this time she did not look back at him. She kept staring at the case summary like the paper was heavier than the house. You can't use that, he said. I'm not trying to use it, I said. I'm trying to remember it correctly, because that was what they had taken from me first. Not money, not a name, memory. They had made me distrust my own version of every room I had ever stood in. David started pacing, one hand rubbing the back of his neck. The careful stepfather was gone now, replaced by the attorney beneath him, calculating exposure, damage, jurisdiction, what words could still be denied. You have no idea what happened, he said. No idea what that family was like. The Bennetts would have buried you in lawyers. Your mother protected you from being turned into an asset. Mom flinched. I looked at her. Is that what Daniel was? I asked. An asset? Her tears finally fell, but quietly, almost with discipline. Daniel was young, grieving, angry. He knew something was wrong, but by the time he started asking the right people, everything was already sealed. Because of you. Her mouth opened. Closed, David answered instead. Because the system worked the way it works. That was the cleanest confession he could give. Not guilt. Procedure. Not theft. Paperwork. He had always loved words that made harm sound administrative. I left that night with my laptop, my phone, the case summary, and the hospital bracelet photo saved in 3 different places. Mom followed me to the porch, barefoot, shaking in the cold, calling me by the name she had given me. Sophia, please. I stopped at the bottom step. For 19 years, that name had been mine. It had held report cards, friendships, birthdays, fevers, bad haircuts, college acceptance letters, and every private little hope I had built inside a life someone else had chosen for me. But now another name stood beside it. Claire, not replacing me, waiting. What was my full name? I asked. Mom gripped the doorframe. She looked behind her once, toward David. Then she looked back at me. Claire Bennett, she whispered. Your name was Claire Bennett. I thought hearing it would break me. Instead, it settled somewhere deep, like a key finding the lock it had been made for. The next morning, I met Elias outside the county courthouse. He had warned me that truth did not move like revenge. It moved through forms, appointments, sworn statements, archived files, people who remembered only enough to be afraid, and people who had waited years for someone with my face to walk back into the record. He was right, nothing happened all at once, but everything started. The expired seal allowed Elias to petition for connected documents. My DNA match tied me to a Bennett relative who had never stopped submitting updates to the missing child database. The hospital bracelet matched the temporary file number. The newspaper clipping led to disciplinary records Marianne had never disclosed. David's emergency custody petition, once presented as a protective action, became the center of a review into falsified timelines and missing transfer approvals. My scholarship office received the documents first, then my resident advisor, then my aunt. One by one, the people David had turned against me stopped sending advice. Some apologized. Some disappeared. Some asked questions only after it became safe to doubt him. That part taught me something. People love truth more when it arrives with paperwork. Marianne was questioned about the transfer records. David's law license came under review. The Bennett estate, which had been held in restricted trust after Daniel's death because his child had never been confirmed dead or alive, was reopened for legal examination. I did not suddenly become rich. I did not suddenly become healed. Real life was slower and uglier than that. But I became undeniable. That was the reversal. For years, David had controlled the rooms because he controlled the language. Concern. Safety, gratitude, family. He could turn any question I asked into proof that I was unstable, ungrateful, easily manipulated. Then the documents changed the language. Fraud, concealment, identity, custody, inheritance. And once the words changed, so did the power. The last time I saw Marianne before the hearing, she asked to meet me at the same kitchen table where she had dropped her phone. David was not there. That was the first condition I gave her, and the first one she obeyed. She looked older in daylight, not evil, not innocent, just human in a way I could finally see without needing to protect her from what she had done. I raised you, she said. I know. I loved you. I know that too. Her hands trembled around a cup of tea she never drank. Then you know it wasn't simple. I looked at the cabinet where my documents had been kept like dangerous objects. It was simple for me. I was a child, she cried then, but I did not move to comfort her. That felt cruel for half a second, then honest. I can't undo it, she whispered. No, I said, but you can stop asking me to carry it for you. That was the first time my voice did not ask permission to exist in that house. The hearing did not give me a movie ending. It gave me records. It gave me certified copies, legal access, a corrected identity petition, and a path to the Bennett Trust that would take months to settle. It gave investigators enough to reopen questions, and David had spent almost 2 decades hiding under procedure. Most of all, it gave me a truth that no one in my family could edit before handing it to me. Elias never became my father. He never tried. He stayed what he had always been. The man who knew where the first lie had been filed, and waited until I was old enough to choose whether to open it. As for me, I kept Sophia. That was the name of the girl who survived the version of life Marianne and David built around her. But I reclaimed Claire. Claire Bennett was not a replacement. She was the proof that I had existed before their story, before their fear, before their signatures. So when people ask why my mother dropped her phone the day I said I had finally met my father, I tell them the truth. She did not drop it because I found my father. She dropped it because I found the one person who could prove she had taken his daughter. And 2 weeks later, when my parents begged me not to see him again, they were not protecting me from a stranger. They were protecting their lie from me.
Sometimes the person calling your questions dangerous isn't afraid you will get hurt. They are only afraid you would learn which version of your life is surviving while you stay quiet.